Hello everyone, after a while we come back on traditional religious content. As you know, Schwerpunkt went through a more mystical phase, especially in the last year, the year before in particular. So for personal reasons, that brought me to widen my actual background in history of religions. At least I have couple of degrees that bear among the various titles that they sum up, like also history of religion, history of Christianity, and I will not make now an introduction of why or how like the thing started. I can only tell you that I created for the first time a history of religion playlist, so that even though it's not really in chronological order, you can get an idea of such path, right? This is, I think, also the reason why outside of YouTube, people began to discuss my views, my ideology, if you want, and trying to actually to sort it out. Admission, having understood what my background really is, I, thank the Reddit crowd and this having been intellectually honest enough to objectively, and I realize it because I definitely don't think in a conventional way. This is not, some self-flattery. It is actually a complex issue because I built all these theories up, mostly from a historical path. Of course, I have also a more personal, private background. Of course, I've always been a conservative. And tradition is something that I approach later, and that went in parallel with, actually, it was preceded by this more intensive, sort of comparative diachronic military historical studying. At the time, actually, also my doctoral research, but especially the Clausewitzian theory that helped me to actually get there before I knew it, and then realizing that religiously wise there was a very strong basis for that sort of vision of the world, and that allowed me in fact to understand better so much of what I had always I had known. Started studying, I studied history of philosophy in school for 3 years, studied philosophy and history of religions at university, and I've always been interested, let's say, in the I could have never studied philosophy professionally for reasons that, in fact, I'm not going to explain either today. But I must say that differently from many people, I guess, the kind of ideas that I developed over time and that I still have to say, I understand I opened, say, a door to, say, I don't want to even say what, I was about to say another dimension or something, but it's actually something deeper and at the same time wider than that, helped me tremendously backing, giving properly an order to all the information that, say, for already a decade had been sort of seriously, at least universitarily and also professionally, put in together. Not really ignoring that such dimension existed in line of principle. As far as I can remember, even as a kid, I was always sort of inclined towards the more arcane, the more, say, absconded, we could even say, aspects of reality. I've never really been satisfied with anyone's explanation. That's also a reason why I don't really have one major point of reference. Even if I use the von Clausewitz avatar here, there is, of course, there is a tremendous respect and admiration, and I love von Clausewitz, etc. But it's my attitude in general towards any great thinker that, of course, I've been influenced by here and there. But even at this point, really rarely. I prefer to criticize rather than, especially fellow historians, and if anything, as I was saying before with philosophy, sometimes I neither sort of engage into some thorough, intellectual relation with this or that figure, right? And in fact, I don't consider myself, I don't want to be considered at all as an intellectual. I'm, believe it or not, much more of an action-based person. And the way I speak and the reason why I speak so much, especially on the internet, because I'm pretty quiet in everyday life, is a mean to an end. It's just a tool, an instrument. that I use to tell people, look, that there are some things that seem to be important, like in a collective, like ecumenic manner, that we should maybe give it a thought or two. I would also like to stress that, fortunately for me, like I arrived later to these ideas enough to have developed before this an important method, which, as I was saying before, hasn't really been spoiled by the, as we'll see now, this knowledge, right? Even calling it theory is not really correct, right? And so I, of course, think that just as humans, as we'll see now, we have limits, we have flaws. This is fundamentally our condition. And so that nothing can be truly and fully explained, or at least it can be, just we can't do it in this specific condition. And that, therefore, there are some points that you cannot approach but saying, look, this is not what you have to believe in a mandatory way. There would be a lot to talk about faith, right, and why this is something that, in fact, you must, by definition, take without any proof, progress proof that there is something out there, but just your belief. That, of course, does derive from a wisdom, and that's where it gets interesting, because if you think about it, most things that we do, it's not really learned to do. Like, we just do them by essence, right? Our cognitive process is not understood scientifically. Nobody actually knows what is going on. Many people comfort themselves with the idea that there is some sort of determinism, simply because, science, that I enormously estimate and I would die for, simply tells you that, it hasn't, if anything, been proven yet, and that should mean something like, since we don't see it, it not just it doesn't exist, but basically cannot exist, and it's wrong to claim that it exists. This is not simply saying, okay, whatever I want to believe, it is, because in fact we are evidently in a condition that is limited in the sense for the wars, like it is limited in our mortality, in our ignorance, in our suffering. And so in a series of elements that seem really to make any other consideration vain in comparison, and that have evidently stimulated the same thought of religion. So the best I can do, really, while introducing these topics, I think, is simply to look at the past, historically, religiously, and say, look, tradition is something that has been shared for millennia by basically any people in the world. It seems that as far as we can document, basically humans believed in the same ecumenic, in fact Catholic belief, and that this basically revolved around the same principles, right? There is no such thing like everything was different peoples believed different things. This is what you've been raised with, like if you're a kid of the 90s, this is what you've been bombarded philosophically, conceptually, methodologically, rhetorically with. And in great part of that, there is actually, it's not that the difference does not exist, because everything is declined according to, in fact, the difference of human beings. It's sort of bizarre that you have been forced instead to believe that basically all human beings are equal, which is probably the greatest lie ever been told. But it's in fact, as we'll see now, in the doctrine of the two natures, about two different conditions, dimensions, and essences that, are actually connected with one another, and that point, like therefore, that they through an axis, right, towards a very specific direction from both sides, and therefore it's mostly what to attain along the way that truly gives meaning to this entire system. It's not much about saying, I know what the truth is, or what God is, or whatever. Nobody really knows. The point is having the distinct realization that our experience tells us that the more we go in a direction, and the more things actually work, which is actually a scientific principle in itself, right? This concept should never be sort of put in antithesis to one another. Rather observe that, of course, also science, as much as religion, can be instrumentalized at different times and for different reasons throughout history, in a way that you should be able to discern in order, if anything, to protect yourself from this same distortion. So today I want to talk about, in fact, the doctrine of the two natures. That is more like just a fundamental premise or part of a broader fundamental premise. I could make thousands of videos about this topics, believe it or not. Yes, I'm a military historian, but I'm also very interested in this stuff, and there is sort of a hidden part of course, of my knowledge. Sorry if it sounds too highly resounding, let's say. But as I said, like I want to explain it because it's part of the history, and especially it is part, and this is how I arrived through it, through the Clausewitzian theory, of what essentially explains the same moral forces that, as we know, are the center of war, and that reciprocally influence one another to an extent that is basically boundless. And von Clausewitz, by the way, understood this beautifully, and when you study his theory of the art of war, you realize that there is deeply, it's not much just the fact that it was contemporary with Hegel or Kant. It's the fact that, of course, there was a pregress, like previously, that there was a world which, a man like him and most of Europe basically was kind of, not only, by the way, was coming from, that had a distinct idea of how essentially the order of the psychophysical order of nature really worked, and he, limits himself in explaining this, regarding the topic of what is war, right, in general, because this is eventually what von Clausewitz really explains. I have received lots of questions. Why don't you talk about the Yomini? We will talk about the Yomini. I may do something soon, but let's say it's very important to reflect first on von Clausewitz. It's important, you should read the Précis de l'art de la guerre perhaps before the von Kriege, but as an exercise, as a shock effect, let's say, but of course also, studying von Clausewitz seriously and for your own good as a person, I would say, is also like a pretty good idea. So in this view, of course, there is also a criticism, as you know, because I'm very polemical in a sort of bit of a paludated way, or a bit of a masked way, not so much actually, regarding what most people would define just as modernity. That, as you know, I don't think it really exists or really existed. I believe that everything that succeeds positively is always aligned with essentially the traditional wisdom that we know at every level, and so many aspects that we attribute to modernity, and that many people tend to. There are some terrible aspects of modernity, in fact, as we'll see now, that are also reflecting, like the generally, like in historical perspective, millenary perspective, how low we have sunk. But the things that actually work are a relic of tradition, and I would say that many people think that they're sort of trying to safeguard tradition, often do not understand that they're the same product of anti-tradition, of modernism, and that mistakes some aspects of modernity, which is a different thing from modernism, for an evil, to the point of let's destroy everything, as if civilization did not have a point, or there wasn't, like in this sense, a broader Catholic achievement in it. I'm not going actually to address this process. I've made already many videos on the topic that you can check out here and there, especially in those videos about the French Revolution, modernity and tradition, all that kind of stuff, the Renaissance, humanism, and more. So the fundamental premise is that it's not much that we live again in a world that is fundamentally founded in modernism, that basically is an antithesis of tradition. Rather, the fact that the last relics of tradition that we handle are the bare minimum that we are handling without collapsing, and essentially losing the awareness of the sacred in our hearts, to the point that we're basically just, like to use a metaphor, driving in the night without lights on, or blindly in the first place, and say handling this power that we have been handed over, in fact, by our forefathers, but that we are basically mismanaging to an ever greater degree. It is actually a very serious problem, because the bigger a the bigger a system, right, like one the globe has become, is actually just by physical principle, like ever more difficult to handle. And so when we see such major sort of moral and scientific shortcomings and exhaustion all around us, and we realize the same gigantic proportions that, at least materially, physically, our world has reached, well, it's as if you had no one at the helm, right? And so saying, but how is this predictable? How what we let's say use to defend our civilizational accomplishment in terms of life quality and expectation and in general say, in fact, accomplishment can last in this way. This is a great problem also politically, as you understand. This is a problem that, for example, I follow, generally speaking, conservative commentators, not too much, as I said before. I'm not a follower by nature, but I have just very few references. Every once in a while I have to sort of check what they're discussing in order to make me aware of, okay, we are at this point. But this is what essentially the allegedly top figures in our world are actually discussing. I made different videos about different figures. If you're interested, I can be more specific too, right? But in this sense, we must start also from the fundamental principle of like this, the doctrine of the two natures. So the idea, as you know, in religion, and to an extent also in history, because of what was fundamentally believed and actually holding systems together, is that a physical as well as a metaphysical order exists. I'm not going to, again, enter into the metaphysics of it, because, you know, there are lots of problems, of course, with the same concept in itself. I will just limit myself to observe that, yes, we have developed definitely, as I was pointing out before, actually, a scientific culture that tends to stick, like, in terms of simplicity and predictability, as the only sort of certain things, while we don't even actually know what it means to know, right, bear this in mind, to a sort of material dimension, right? This is why, of course, this is not much about the idea of, again, of religion per se, but it's like, as a historian, that to an extent is also sort of social scientist. It's readily obvious, especially when you try, as I do in my work, to sort out pretty big systems, that you cannot practically reason. This was also the Clausewitzian, that's also how I use the Clausewitzian method, not just in military history. You have to go beyond the delusion that you can be able, without any other fundamental ability, to just start counting the world piece by piece, materially, without even knowing where you're going with that, and not even taking on the world by itself, and essentially starting to build up your muscles by wrestling with the massive forces that are out there, so that by the moment you're exhausted and you're, you know, well built, you can still see what the world is about, and you can appreciate those powers that really agitate within it, as also constituting it, and therefore explain it better. Because after all, this is the point. Like, why do we even research matter, and you know, and or something that also is beyond, of course, scientifically, but that, you know, if not for that practically applicable, say, engineeristic or chemical, like, you know, very practical, hard to, you know, matter down to the matter kind of purpose, right? That's also why some people say, oh, you know, humanities are worthless, right? Aside from, of course, the fact that at least in a part of the West, this have been largely hijacked by Marxism, and that is unironically also, in fact, a very materialistic ideology, to say the least, and selling this very cheap, right, Untermensch idea that basically a person should just be, I don't know, told to study, I don't know, matter, economy, and as if, understanding politics or history, and moral forces, and how they operate in the world would be less relevant. This is actually one of the first indicators of the severe, almost subhuman underdevelopment that we are witnessing in our own world. Now, there is, in this division between the physical and metaphysical order, that you could reduce to essentially as a definition, a doctrine of the two natures, but we must understand how they interact with one another. That's the most important thing. A nature of mortals and a nature of immortals. All right. We'll understand better now what it means. There is a superior reasoning of being, and there is an inferior reasoning of becoming. In other words, there is a perennial superiority. I'm not going to discuss here whether it's something, say, hypostatically existing or something that you simply have to achieve. And then there is another world that is fundamentally degenerating, right? At least tendentially degenerating. This is the idea of why the world ages and why essentially we are detaching ourselves from the possibility of individual salvation and essentially resorting to the, say, to the one through our own forces. Now, more generally, there exists both a visible and a tangible realm, right, that is more familiarly understood, in fact, in material terms. Some would call it reality, per se, so as we'll see now, understanding there's something more to it, and in fact a connection to another realm, which is, in fact, actually in tradition preceding the tangible one. Right, laying under it. And it is, in fact, an invisible, an intangible realm, which can be characterized as the superworld, right, the underlying principle. And in this sense, the essence of true life, which is something that, again, is still not known. Right, fundamentally through that approach that science has sort of crystallized through at least in a lazy human way, not because science per se is not the effort to understand truly, since its philosophical origins, the origin of such things, and again the reasons why certain fields of research also do not even exist to some extent, and or without making it too controversial, still, of course, are pretty advanced and dramatically advanced and insanely so, with enormous progress, but still not, for example, finding an overall unitary coherence, or to some extent also dissipating themselves into speculation in a matter of just literally personal opinions, because this is literally what a scientist, and I say it even myself as a PhD, how do you think it is? There is, that we are the ones that know things, and it's just like that, and we are the ones who just put 100% true mark on stamp on things, so that other people can simply repeat that. Or this is actually an incredibly alarming indicator of the radical ignorance that the average person really lives into, and that perfectly matches also the negative status in the doctrine of the two natures, right? There is not such a thing. To an extent, we are truly, we build these theories that are just a pretty miserable, attempt to make sense, inspirationally sometimes at least, of the world, but that obviously fall short of our poor cognitive means and more, right? And of course, the origin of life seems to be the single most important question of all, right? It's not a matter of, again, declined like humanistic reflection simply because, I don't know, life must be a big deal, and in our world we have to think how to tell people what it kind of is. Like, this is literally how, say, the key to mortality and immortality is. This is how being and not being is really all about. And in a way, like, just looking at the past and all the main religious currents and even the secondary ones really point all to the same direction that has to do with the essence of true life and true love as well. And this is a concept that perhaps we will expand on in another, say, series of the channel. Now, throughout the world of tradition, so you see this is everywhere we look, in the East, in the West, this knowledge of the existence of such double nature, or better, of these two natures, right, has consistently been present, right, in one form or another, serving as an unshakable axis around which everything else was organized. It was not ever like an alternative to this idea. Now the question is, why would apparently like primitive, ignorant, underdeveloped people without science and knowledge, whatever, would actually think all the same thing? Just per se is very interesting. Of course, you can't provide a lay with a lay answer concerning like the fact that yes, more or less there is an existential condition of man at some limits that fundamentally appear readily evident, especially in conditions of great deprivation and material misery. So in a much more difficult life, of course, than that, like the one it was at the time. But at the same time, it makes you think, especially looking at the level of actual engagement of these people into these beliefs and the degree by which these beliefs have essentially moved the entire history, and fundamentally that our own ideas are still like the pale reminiscence of, in a way or another, whether without these, like, life itself wouldn't make any sense. And at that point the question is also, again, what is life, and why were these religions essentially revolving around all, like, not much of a definition but an attainment, a push towards action, but also of the possibility of transcendence of this condition, of our condition. There is also much more. This could also be explained. Like, now, today we will not see like the entire mythologies, the origins of this life and more, but everything is, of course, to be understood metaphorically in a way that makes sense only when you contextualize it through the sources, and, for example, their original, say, authentic etymologies, and in many ways also declining it to the single historical context that, of course, would enrich it with a specific vision of the same, specific, in fact, language, specific imagery, and more. And the thing, especially that, as a historian, strikes me, of course, is how in history as well, this mechanism of let's completely ignore this side of the story and let's just frame religion as a sort of 19th, 20th century categoristic dichotomy for throughout all history does, right? I always say this, I'm always shocked by it when I think about it. Like, most people, most actual adults believe, for example, that, I don't know, the great imperial Roman religion, for example, was a polytheistic system. I mean, people, they actually believe this. It's not like they even suspect that it's not a thing, or if you tell them, they're going to say, well, okay, maybe there is something to it that I didn't know. It's as if we had been specifically pushed to believe what, if you study the same religions of the time, you immediately understand that it wasn't such, for not talking about paganism, right? The mere concept of paganism would have been an insult to whom we call the pagans. Was the most fractionalistic sort of anti-Catholic belief pertaining to the lower masses that were actually looking up to leads to the leaders to actually hopefully transcend their condition as well, and they were perfectly aware of the unitary beliefs that existed in the world, and that didn't have really any doubt about the validity of in principle, in physical and metaphysical principle. Another very important vocabulary here, a distinction to understand the wall, is that we're not speaking, when talking about the doctrine of the true natures, about, as for any traditional belief, of, say, what we intend today as theory. Well, the average person thinks that theory means, in theory, that is something not proven, right? So for all those people who think, this is just a theory, science doesn't know anything because they haven't proved it, I'm more intelligent, right? Yeah, except you're a squalid fourth estater with no money, with no beauty, with no intelligence. That if that makes you feel better about yourself, go on like that. We will happily keep ruling over you, because that's what you really deserve. There is another level, of course, which our own theory, which is of course a cogent system of data that we collect and that we essentially frame within a logical explanation delimited by specific aspects, as we were saying before, the same scientific method, and so more or less stopping to a if I don't see it, if I don't touch it, if I can't say describe it, I can't really get it, right? And I must say, in history, this is something, as I was saying before, immediately that it doesn't hold water. You cannot, for example, explain history simply in that way. You can have a theory, but this theory is not merely a bunch of sources that you simply put together. It is something more. It's actually part of an experience, and what the ancients would have called like knowledge, rather, and wisdom, right? So in part is, see, if you said that it's a gut feeling, you would immediately say, this is subjective. This is just a subjective belief. You cannot validate it because you cannot rationally explain it, right? It's merely a matter of feeling, so you're maybe under some impression that in any case, even if it were right, this is the problem, you cannot simply express and make others understand the same way. Just think in your life how important it is, like those words that you've been told, hopefully, by your elderly, like, until you get there, you really don't understand that, right? You may have a good, actually theoretical background, but until you get through it, you will not understand it, right? It's just like driving a motorcycle, right? You may think how to do it, you will dream to do it, etc. But until you do it, you don't really know how it actually is. And this discriminant is also the fact that you are actually at that point driving a motorcycle. It's not like thinking of it and still not being there. And so there is a connection between intentionality, so what we call free will, and the mere root of also why we want that. Where does going back, lead? Right, this is just like history. There are lots of people, like the ones, for example, who ask me for sources on Schwerpunkt, on general topics that, of course, a person like me has, even just studied from the basic manuals at the beginning, could explain that in the first year, and that, of course, studied for decades, and that really does not need to give you maybe the hundreds or thousands of sources, or this, in fact, broader awareness and, say, experience that I got through studying them, just to make you not to make you distrustful, and that's a you problem, right? It's an emotional problem, it's a subjective problem, that's its problem. The person, in this sense, actualizing this knowledge is not really is really counting on the knowledge being correct and valid, and not needing any other confirmation, and or, like, of course, knowing that it's a complex thing, as we were saying before, it's limited, it's faulty, but that in that essence is valid, right? With history, it's not just giving sources that where do you go back with sources, right? How do you think that, say, writing a book, right, a monography about a certain topic really goes? That you are actually doing what? Adding just the elements that other people wrote before about, and you maybe having found a new source and adding that, and that's how it works. If you go back to what exactly? You will get back to the same source that it will have been interpreted by the first person that has used it, and every source is interpreted. And you can argue in that negative sense that all of it is subjective, because still, what does it mean even to know, or to read, or to touch, or to see? Isn't that subject to some sort of uncertainty as well? And how do we link things together? It's just like, again, how do you learn how to drive a motorcycle? It's not that we have a scientific model that tells us how to drive a motorcycle. This thing is incalculable. There is no calculator in the world that can even sort out how to begin with, like the same concept, right? The thing is done anyway, and this is what you should be amazed at. Especially thinking of life. But of course, no, it's just all about a bunch of metropolitan, materialistic superstitions that you've been drugged with, just thinking that world goes just for some odd deterministic reason that you can't do anything about. Now, as challenging as it may be for contemporary individuals to grasp, we must begin with the notion that the traditional men recognized the existence of a reality and order of being far more expansive than the term real encompasses today. Right? I often say myself, what I'm really doing when studying history, when researching history, is learning what happened in reality, right? Because it's not an abstract speculative model. You actually have the relics of what happened in reality. It's faulty. It's not telling you to give the whole picture. But it still happened. It's still the proof of something that is real, right? And so that we can essentially admit as such. And so history is real to a large extent. Reality, however, is in this sense understood still within the practical limits of such means, right? It's just like when I write an article, I express this, as I was saying before, a theory about how this or that army operated on the field, and say we have different pieces that can make for this theory. It also actually does make sense. We evidently see by common sense that it would have worked like in that way, but that we never have the full picture of, to the extent that we can delimitate its, say, many aspects of its technicalities, for example, and also the lesser things. That's why history, hyper-specialization today is really, so, fallen in quality, because people are trained just to, first of all, earn money with publishing, and so it's not much about what you publish, but how much or where, whatever, with which means. We are creating a lot of trash at so many level, and essentially the best way to do that is doing ever smaller researches, minimal things, all very much subjective to the point of let's rethink what this thing is, and essentially not contributing to the actual reconstruction of what, say, the bigger systems really were, which is what technically actually in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, we tended to do, because we understood, of course, being sort of the most important things. And when we tend to rethink everything and realize that actually, like somebody else, for example, this is very typical of today's generation of researchers, that has actually provided with large, exhaustive explanations of this, or has really very strong solid points about certain topics, etc., that are so difficult even to go back and restudy, because there is so much of that you can appreciate the limit itself of how, let's say, what you are at least sold for being reality really is. At least the way I try to reconstruct this reality is something that I want to push as far as possible in terms of historical accuracy and finding out what actually happened in this reality. But it's obvious that this reality is boundless. It's something that goes beyond it, and the near-term reality is a sort of cloth that we apply to the universe, just for us sort of to recognize it in a certain way, but whatever is in the in fact in the metaphysical dimension, where does this whole thing stem from, and why does this happen in the way it does, is really another issue, right? Imagine the traditional man actually knowing constantly to be living in this. It's not much just about how precarious a life was, and so how obliged people were to think this reality, but how much more intensely aware of such depth, right, they would have really been. In contemporary understanding, the concept of reality primarily relates to the realm of physical bodies in space and time, right? People think the reality of, there's a car accident, the police has to sort out how it happened, right? And everybody knows, just the historical version of the story, that no version of what happened is ever equal to another. Every person experiences, it's not just like that they experience it from a different perspective, but they will actually express it in a faulty way, even as far as what they have sensorially experienced is really concerned. And so you understand that what emerges as reality is something pretty, sort of messed up, even when we tend to fix those, elementary coordinates of time and space, and how bodies in it really are. Admittedly, of course, still today, some individuals acknowledge the existence of something beyond the tangible, right? You can argue that this is really impossible to eliminate in humanity. It's not just believing in, again, some aliens having the technology to travel across the universe and being so dumb to crash in a tree here on Earth. However, this kind of acknowledgement of something beyond the tangible can be, in part, yes, that sort of, if you want, speculative. And in this sense, it mostly pertains to and is framed within, especially like by, the collective convention, within a hypothesis that is sort of the weaker form, at least if we accept as hypothesis really any kind of that speculation, but it can be even a scientific law, right? After all, what are scientific laws? Everything is based on concepts that, as far as we know, are purely an act of fate. That is, believing that a point, a line, and a surface exist. What a point, a line, and a surface are, to this day, nobody has no idea, nor morally, nor scientifically, but our entire mathematical, physical knowledge is founded on it, right? And still, of course, there are laws that we tested in reality, but also, what does this really tell us about the underneath of it, right? And how aware are we actually of the origin of it? There are obvious limitations to a degree that we do not even know, we cannot know by definition whether there is, not whether there is anything beyond, but how limited this beyond is. Because it can easily be infinite as far as we're also within the same, frames concerned. So there are also, and of course, and here we're talking just about some of the most, some of the hardest knowledge that we have actually about the universe. And again, I never want to push in any way in this traditional religion episodes any kind of scientific bias at all. There is scientism that is a pretty sorrowfully disgusting thing. It's not by claiming to be interested in science and then still not thinking about these things that makes that you will be an intelligent person, an accomplished person, or whatever. The same goes for religious dogma, right? Here, of course, this channel is largely, it expresses, of course, very much the historical explanation through religious belief, because This is first of all what people people believe in, and that motivate as a broader frame of in a broader system of values the same action. But as I often say, like it's not just equally claiming to be conservative or even religious, specifically religious or whatever, that makes you actually aware of that non-tangible dimension. You can believe in all the religious dogma that you want, but this is still conceptually framed in today's world within the same sort of level of, say, hypothesis. It's not something that you're basically actualizing with your existence. It's something that essentially you treasure, something that's surely important. It's surely like all this scientific and religious knowledge, and that is surely a trace of the beyond, but that still is not handled by people through this beyond, right? It does not transcend the aforementioned limitations. This is the most fundamental point, right? I'm very, and I almost never talk about liberals or leftists because it's just like a world that, to me, this traditional faith imposes me to bypass completely, at least in the moment in which I, of course, have to tame it, which I fully do, like in my power, and that, of course, is not even important to address. But when you look at conservatism, and so ideally also where many people see me within in the first place, I'm actually terrified by this sort of pseudo neo-conservativistic. I don't even want to add any specifically, say, qualifying adjective of what this beliefs stem from, but it obviously has not to do with literally anything that I can consider as tradition, nor being ever like interested in this sense of transcendence. So practically speaking, regardless of the disparities between the materialistic and spiritualistic beliefs, the average person today constructs their perception of reality solely based on the physical world. And again, it's of course virtually so, because there is always a gateway to the non-tangible. But again, being a materialist or being a spiritualist is not about that, just per se. It's not a form of wisdom, it's a form of theoricism. And it doesn't even start addressing the actual underlying problem, which is essentially also the human one, as we will understand now. The genuine materialism, for which, say, people have to be criticized, fundamentally lays in this, right? There, other materialisms, understood as philosophical or scientific opinions, are secondary phenomena. It's not about what you actually believe politically or scientifically, or let's say what kind of books you read or whatever. This is fundamentally about the way you have been habituated to theorize such ideas as if there were some sort of, I don't know, knowledge you could fall back on when you have to mechanically do something in real life, and basically not concerning yourself with nothing else. And in regarding to this, say, to such materialism, it's not merely a matter of opinion or theory. Rather, it pertains to the fundamental state of affairs characteristic of a human type whose experience is limited to grasping only corporeal things. And of course, say, philosophically, you could expand on this concept by observing just even like what the average lifestyle is, and why, let's say, and how this gradual detachment from the intangible is really common, like what you would mostly think like of the contestation of modernization, or however you want to call it, obviously clashes with the more obvious spread of, let's say, materialism in parallel with the greater availability of material goods that you can simply consume, and apparently, as we'll explain now, keeping that fallen dimension artificially satisfied by actually corrupting it ever further along the way, and never addressing, this is the problem also of this behaviors, never addressing the fundamentally, moral principle behind the necessity of at least of the awareness of the two natures. It's like, I don't know, somebody who has an addiction that is destroying them, and say somebody tells them out of wisdom, just like, you must cut with this, like you must seek for help, and this person says, no, I want to selfishly destroy me because at the moment it makes this thing simply makes me feel better. It's not about any principle anymore. It's the centrality of the physicality that really drives the entire thing. This is an incredibly important concept in tradition because, as you know, we have also observed in the videos about the struggle, say the doctrine of struggle and victory, the greatest attainment of the hero is to exactly defeat this darker material physical forces within oneself, so that they will actually be transcended themselves together with the spirit back to the one, which is also an incredibly different concept from, of course, the Gnostic heresy, that is just instead like an escapism from the physical prison, and essentially a complete defeat and reversal of the possibility of course, to divinize once again, to actualize yourself once again, and basically it's pure suicide and self-destruction. So even when you look at the, say, more say general, still present, only apparently intellectual, say, in the sense that they're self-intellectual, revolts against such, say, materialism or materialistic perspective, you realize that these aren't nothing more than futile reactions to the ultimate and peripheral effects of distant and profound causes that mostly, in fact, this sort of self-intellectualism doesn't even start looking at, because somehow they stem just from, again, we're scared of matter. People who don't have actually morals, right? This is the actual thing. It's paradoxically the left. Remember consumerism? Like in the 90s, we were bombarded with consumerism. Like today, we live a overwhelmingly scholarly, exponentially more consumeristic reality than ever before, but nobody talks about it anymore. This is very interesting. And it's not that we should be scared. Of course, like this material abundance doesn't mean that it's not to be escaped, right? It's actually a proof of imperial success. The point is, as we were saying in the beginning, who does have the power to handle it anymore? Who has the moral muscles, the necessary awareness to be able to transcend it into the intangible dimension? This is the real actual issue. It's all theories, right? Saying your own. You have been trained essentially to think that everything that a person says has per se, if not equal value, something that more or less stands on the same level. Wrong, right? If something doesn't work, it doesn't. Point. Right? It's something is unintelligent, is false, whatever. Like, why should that opinion be even considered? Why shouldn't the person expressing that not be shamed and just be relegated where their own condition of failure, right, of incapacity, brings them? Now, going back and looking at the traditional world, like we could think that people, much like today, as a remnant observed in some so-called primitive populations, extended far beyond such limits. There's another issue that we will discuss when talking about the so-called primitive peoples. Another very common mistake that pseudo-traditionalists do is thinking that being culturally underdeveloped and backwards and poor and unaccomplished and paranoidly, barely surviving at the fringes of the civilized world has anything to do with any trace of tradition. Tradition is the diametrically opposite of this. There is nothing to be proud in being a culturally inferior people at any level, right? The point, though, is that, and we will have to explain the difference between form and substance for that matter, of course, that many peoples that sort of didn't go through the explosion of power due to the actual matching of traditional principles, that is something that the West fundamentally brought to the world, have not been posed in front of that kind of scale of power, and so they still maintain some traditional form that might devoid of substance, or sometimes also vice versa, depending on what kind of level this thing is. I mean, again, it's not just by following formally or exteriorly a more traditional principle that, as we were saying before, you're actually understanding any of that. Right? Do you think that most people, like in the second and third worlds, actually understand their own religions? Are you kidding? There is all a history of religion that shows you how there are cycles of belief, and of course that these beliefs die out, and this phenomenon is not directly proportional to the level of development at all. These are 19th century deterministic, materialistic obsessions that made also of racism a sort of, zoological materialism and determinism. They have nothing to do with any trace of traditional principle, right? There is, however, something in the way, say, primitive peoples believe, and who are these primitives, by the way, like it's hunter-gatherers are incredibly dull, right? They don't actually have any of these beliefs, and they are incredibly materialistic, actually, and so we'll have to explain also in this word, it's not like that an evolutionistic perspective here at play, for which the least developed are the ones who sort of came first, and we were all like that. No, the opposite is true. Like there is, of course, in tradition, and this is, of course, sort of the more controversial things in, say, modern terms, that the opposite, like the fall from heaven, right? The fall from divinity. So what we're looking at in the more primitive and more underdeveloped cases is actually the ones who have fallen more short of divine grace. And again, don't make even here the mistake, it is just about material reality. This is about actual power, which is another thing. You can have for example, materially wealthy communities that, however, are very weak, right? And more primitive communities that aren't, but that they are powerful and can take them over. But the majority of cases, it actually ain't like this. So, of course, who obtains that matter also has the moral means to have gotten there. And so be extremely careful about who you oppose in the world still today. Because, again, also in this sense, that the populistic, nationalistic, and or socialistic, because the two things actually go always in parallel, and so essentially leftistic, terroristic, red aspects of conservatism that have nothing to do with tradition, of course, are always looking at the culturally inferior as somebody provided with some kind of, quality that is just actually a way not to admit that they are within the superior cultures, the inferior ones we cannot afford, but to look at those who are lesser and suggesting that that would be an achievement. And in fact, the countries who mostly express this are based on lies as a national identity, especially after totalitarianism and very specific, especially the socialistic, communistic regimes. They're still all there in the same way. You don't change from communism in 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations. It takes hundreds of years, if you're lucky, to get out of that. And there is a lot of psychiatric work to be done at a mass level before any of that is even remotely fixed. In any case, again, more primitive cultures can show you, still very much in a superstitious, materialistic way, but still, like how aware, because they are the fourth estate, say pagans proper, not the imperial Catholic rulers. They are this underdeveloped peoples at the fringe. How the invisible is perceived as an element that is real, right? There is no doubt in their minds, and that's actually like the positive that lays in their culture. And in fact, the single most fundamental traditional principle is the fact that the invisible is even more real than the data derived from the physical senses. And this can be explained like in a realization of, if you want, a very humble, say, acceptation of your own limits, at least your current limits, then what you do about it is the whole thing. But that places you in that sense of, what the hell I think I can be if I don't even know what the origin of life is, or what the universe. I didn't say the origin of the universe because that would make the same thing, but people are obsessed and say not much with the origin of life, apparently with the origin of the universe. Why? Because that scientific, materialistic, dogma has pushed us to think, who cares about life? That sort of must come along the way. That, of course, in all traditional mythology, life precedes, of course, the material side of the story. So, but you're always being thought, it's the universe. The universe is this old. We think that, I don't know, it was like the Big Bang, and then we don't know. The universe will keep expanding, but we don't know. Eventually, we'll die. It's not even incorrect as far as we understand traditionally. It's just like that. If people had studied mythology, they would knew pretty well that these texts say the same identical thing that we came to, of course, know through material evidence about the universe. But that is literally the same. I mean, the aging of the world, of course, is the second principle of thermodynamics, like thermic death of the universe, this falling apart of everything, and the incapacity of bringing one together, and the original force of the universe being, in the sense, the primal order that was somehow broken, and that we would have the task of bringing ones together again. And again, these are things we will see in other videos, but it's almost childlike the way, like, we literally had the evidence for millennia, and we all believed in it. And then all of a sudden we said, no, this stuff does not exist. Of course, we all know how it happened. It's mass society, like nationalist and or socialist, leftistic fourth estate or terrorism, saying that religion, nobility do not exist, that the average person is good, is beautiful, is capable, whatever, you shouldn't worry about that. So to make you even weaker than what you already and unfortunately are, so that you can be better commanded. And it fundamentally a great hatred towards accomplishment, great social envy, a sense that, if I fail, it's better that everybody fails, because I don't want to feel like my own sin, my own burden, my own fault. All right. Except that makes you just. Okay, it makes also the world weaker, but let's say, it's not that you're not irreplaceable, by the way. And especially when you consider the regenerating force, like that lays within divine power, in that regard, that is also one of the greatest attainments, the greatest attainment in tradition, together with lots of other manifestations of the same. So, in this sense, in tradition, every mode of life, both individual and collective, acknowledges its significance. There's not such thing like, I don't know, that thing is just that person's fault, right? Legally, we've been habituated to think like this because we had at least to make up for the potential issue, at least trying to rebalance things out. But we were not habituated to think at all that everything that happens to us, if anything, because it happens, it's still equally, say, overlappingly, our fault. It's not like the other person that does it has no fault, but we have fault at the same time. and for not having prevented it, and still this encompasses the whole universe. That kind of thing happening has made the universe a different place. And yes, there is a way to fix it, but it has to pass through, in fact, this re-acknowledgement of the intangible, so going towards a direction that we've been completely de-habituated to think, while everything sinks further. And this is very tragic, because if things are going wrong gradually, it's obvious that justice is the perishing, and the evidence that what happens to us is ever more, is even more evidently our own fault. Maybe potentially even the trigger of that spiritual revival. But this isn't yet another story. If what is traditionally referred to as reality today was merely as pieces within a much larger journey, then the invisible was not simply equated with the supernatural, right? This is explained partially in the video I made about the Sol Invictus eternally rising as the king of the living. As we understand, like, there are different levels. Like, there is a human world, then an underworld, and then a heaven, right? And say our world, the world of the living, is truly the one in which things are in becoming, right? And determine what gets where regarding the outer world. Traditionally, the concept of nature did not solely correspond to the realm of visible bodies and forms on which our secularized science of modernity has focused. It also encompassed and fundamentally included a part of invisible reality itself, right? And there, for example, prevailed a vibrant sense of an underworld. This realm was inhabited by dark and ambiguous forces of all kinds. And it's a mistake to even speak in past tense here. This is literally what it's supposed to be. This is the worst that we can become. You can argue that we all have this transfiguring capacity. It's not just a matter of epigenetics, but literally what is our soul, for example. So this dark and ambiguous forces of all kinds were so because no force actually can exist without, as we've seen, a level of positivity. And so there is some possible regurgitation, even from the lower levels of powers, that must be actually, I made a video explaining how the Dionysian works in the Apollonian Transfiguration as well, in order to be, in fact, to attain superior reality by those who know how to use it. This is the demonic soul of nature, right? And it's part of ourselves. It's part of all the natural world as well. A natural world that, in this sense, is not your friend at all, right? It's always to be understood in an antagonistic way. That, however, it's like the dragon to slay. Will once tamed, will give you what the wisdom that is necessary for you to elevate yourself. And this was, say, this darker part was the essential substratum of all its forms and energies as well. This also stood in contrast to the supra-rational and sidereal clarity of a higher domain. The reason why I say supra-rational is not that tradition rejects reason as a tool. Actually, there is a degree of contemplation next to the action. And of course, reason belongs to that. Rationalism is anti-traditional, but reason is a mean that we must use evidently as a prosthesis, as a mental prosthesis for our cognitive deficit, so that we can achieve that much through scientific knowledge, for example, in terms of power, right? And it is definitely a real achievement. But the idea is that heavenly divinity, by definition, has reached a form of museological perfection that reason is not needed anymore. So this is barely act before thinking kind of idea. Just everything has to be action. We don't even have to think what we're doing. Just like for example, we've seen the Freikorps. in a recent video. And so that cult of, okay, let's destroy everything that we have of useful in every sense, just because, we have to be, we don't even understand what's going on, but that's the only thing you must do. That's not to say that you don't have to get into the meat grinder to understand certain things, and that can be sort of the most awakening experience of your life, but you shouldn't throw away the pre-acquired wisdom that will tell you how to act or how not to act depending on the circumstance, right? You have to be initiated as a warbender is a different thing, but you're still at the lowest level of the chain. That's why the leader is actually of course a grizzled man. Odin is an old person, at least in appearance, because he's wise. His visits, he can actually see the future, right? He doesn't have to get into it, into the fray in order to know how it will go. He will simply make things go the way they have to, because he already has sorted out how he can influence that. And it's both. What is important about tradition is that this is actually compatible both with determinism and free will, right? These actually are one, as what happens is by itself sacred, and it was in this sense meant to be, but not because it's less wanted in a deliberate sense by someone that actually will make the difference in doing it based on his own decision. Furthermore, nature, in a traditional sense, also encompasses everything that is merely human, which of course does not escape the same fate of birth and death. On the contrary, there is this level of impermanence, of dependence and change inherent to the lower realm. Humanity is like this. It's like, eating. It's not that once you eat, it's over. You'll never eat in your life again. You're still always dependent, and you're finite, and you are actually wearing out yourself and your bodily structure through literally existing in this world. But this happens just because there are forces that are at play and that you're basically not able to control. So, by definition, in the doctrine of the true natures, the superior realm, so what it is, right, the eternal, the immortal, cannot by definition pertain to a human or temporal states and conditions, right? The superior nature pertains to the divine. Men are a different race from one of God's, because there is a merit of quality in such difference. It's not by descending from the gods that you're actually relevant. We were just talking about it the other day in that beautiful passage by Boethius in the De Consolatione Philosophiae, where say, my ancestors are this, my ancestors are that. You know how many times on Schwerpunkt people are not going to watch, but they just stepping, by saying, thanks that you made this video. I descend from this guy. And then they leave it. You never hear them anymore in years. Just imagine that guy with traditional knowledge thinking about his descendants, if there actually are his descendants, and realizing that these are people that as human beings, in their own self-actualization, tour YouTube to say, I am, this is my 14th grandfather, even assuming that is true, and that person would have killed you. Just by the way, they would have preferred to put an end to their offspring if they had known the level of abysmal, insignificance that offspring had degenerated, corrupted, fallen into. And of course, the being, the perennial being, was conceived that the reference to this superior order beyond the world could guide the integration and purification of the human within the non-human. Right? There couldn't be essentially, these are not separated worlds. right? They are functional to one another. This is just like in the doctrine of castes. These castes are meant to be, if you want, antagonistic, to do different things. But he who is at the top has through God's grace, for example, the capacity of redeeming the world, transfiguring the world. And we'll be seeing this. This is really essentially constitutional and purposeful for every truly traditional civilization. That's why the relation with God, the fetus, it was so, let's say, primally relevant to them, and why there couldn't be anything else that identified them by this relation. And what this dynamically offered. Now, the world of being and the world of becoming, so, and mostly degenerating, but also, again, becoming in the sense that it can reach God once again, depending just on the direction that you take, encompass the realms of things, demons and men. Furthermore, every hypostatic figuration, whether astral, mythological, theological, or religious, of these two domains refer traditionally humanity to two states which served as symbols meant to be resolved through an inner experience or in the premonition of such an experience. When you look at the Vedic tradition and in the later Buddhism that stemmed from it, there is a concept, the one of samsara, right? This is seen as a current that dominates and carries every form of the lower world. This is where the cyclical view of the world really comes from. I little bet how many times you've said that before the terrible evil Christianity, by the way, there wasn't like a linear view of time, all right, or the destiny of mankind. And this was kind of bad because it was kind of telling just one direction, right? Instead, those peaceful cultures, that existed before, all believed, by the way, of course, of the cyclicality of life, and everything was so harmonious or whatever. India is, in this sense, the best example of this current of the same samsara, of course, that originates from there as a world. And do you know what the samsara really is in this? It refers to the beginningless cycle of repeated birth that is just mundane existence and death, right? It's just like an eternal, like you were thrown in a water closet for the rest of your existence until it literally disappear. Samsara is regarded, in fact, as dukkha, which translates to suffering, and is generally seen as unsatisfactory and painful. It's not to say that you can find, of course, also in this cycle, as we've seen, the ingredients for elevation. But it's not the cycle itself that is positive. The cycle is perpetuated, in fact, by the desire, the avidya, that is the ignorance, along with the resulting karma that basically gets you what you essentially you deserve. In the sense, you want that much, you want to lay your own self outside of your own self, you don't want to actualize, you will be fed for so long until you're so weak that you will destroy yourself, right? So the samsara, the current, the cyclical vision, actually belong to the chthonic dimension, to the lesser elements of the world and society. Of course, the great rulers, the Indo-European conquerors, for example, had a crystally linear view of their metaphysical Catholic condition. And of course, this doesn't mean that the cyclicality did not exist within their worlds. Of course, the world cyclically changes, and because it is the same product of the fall from divinity. That's why seasons exist. That's why our differences exist, right? But it's not a positive thing. You must draw the good of it to reunite to the sempiternal. But in itself, this is closely linked to a conditional life just characterized by blind desire and irrational identification. So of limitation and death, right? And of course, all these peoples had, of course, a linear concept of the world as well. But for some reason, you've been told otherwise. There's a lot of feministic reasons why that is the case, of course, and complete denial, of course, of the male and female archetypal functionality in all this, in superiority and inferiority, and divine attainment. Never mind. Now, similarly, if we look, for example, at ancient Greece, you see the notion of nature frequently personified in the eternal privation of that which, possessing its own principle and its own act outside itself, flows and escapes from itself indefinitely, thereby illustrating the concept of axireonta. That is to say, you want again to be dependent on something that lays outside yourself, you will be forever doomed to chase it, because you're literally misusing yourself, you're ignoring your potential, you're not doing anything to struggle and win or die in the enterprise, and so you prefer to just stay on the side and die away slowly, right? And this is actually what most people who complain about the world today really do, right? They're not heroes, they're slaves, right? Just to cite, so spoke Zarathustra. This is because the becoming manifests an original and radical abandonment, perpetual defect of limit, right? Plotinus, for example, was very clear about this. Plutarch in the Iside et Osiride, for example, is also quite telling. There are very specific, again, literary references to this, and I will, the more we talk about this topic, try to, in fact, cite accurately each of them. So in these traditions, by the way, matter and becoming express what within a being is an uncontrollable indeterminacy or obscure necessity, the impotence to realize itself in a perfect form, to fully possess itself according to a law, right? Matter is the substance, the spirit is the form, right? And the nomos, especially the law, that, remember, we will see it now, like it is not just a law or something, approximately applied by an imperfect system, but the same will of God made universal law, so something that you cannot really escape from and that any other endeavor will unavoidably crash against, right? And by the way, the Greeks referred to this form, say it's the anankaion, that is to say the necessary, and the apeiron, the infinite, right? So what has fully actualized itself. In India, the Vedic term was adharma, right, in Sanskrit, derived from a combination of a with dharma, which literally implies not dharma. It means immoral, sinful, wrong, wicked, unjust, unbalanced, or unnatural. So all the opposite of this is the adharma, and so essentially the truth, God. Naturally, the medieval tradition had something to say about this as well. When you look at Neoplatonism in its mystical aspects, or the Aristotelian Thomistic scholasticism, you realize that much of these concepts were treasured. Thomas Aquinas, Dante, Meister Eckhart, there are so many authors who can easily quote. Scholasticism in particularly held similarly aligned ideas by identifying cupiditas, so the cupidity, this crave really, and appetitus innatus, which means innate hunger, fundamentally wishful, let's say, desire, in the sense of subsuming, like nourishing yourself with something, as something else, you see, something alien that is not coming from within your full potential, right? As life, that is provided with that instead of that divine spark, as the root of all unredeemed nature. Right? Medieval scholasticism, the pillar of Western civilization, the medieval universalism, understood as sinful anything that basically made you wish something that was out of your own purpose, of your metaphysical, say, beyond tangible purpose, right? And that could redeem the world entire, and that's how Christ had accomplished, like, the ecumenic conquest. In one way or another, so the traditional man thus uncovered in the experience of greedy identification, which obscures and damages being, the secret of that situation in which the incessant process of becoming, along with the perennial instability and contingency of the lower realm, manifests as a cosmic-symbolic materialization. Now we'll explain, of course, how this lower realm had been created as an accident also of the higher one, but the idea is that these extremes existed, right? That this accident was wanted by our own fall from God's grace, from our divine status. This is not having acquired knowledge. Knowledge was contained in that superiority. It's having acquired the pernicious knowledge of this limitation, of the fact that you could die. This is what actually the symbol of the snake really is. Not like the Gnostic mental disturbance of believing that this had to know with, I don't know, I'll tell you that things exist because this evil god is controlling you. You know, this doesn't make, of course, any sense in any Catholic tradition. And by the way, on the contrary, in belonging to oneself and giving oneself form, in possessing within oneself the principle of a life that is no longer dispersed and no longer wandering here and there in search of something or someone to complete and justify oneself, no longer fractured by the necessity and by the irrational striving outward toward the external and the different, in a word, in the experience of asceticism, one perceives the path to understanding the other realm, the domain of being, that which is no longer physical but metaphysical, intellectual nature of deprived sleep, of which solar symbols, Uranic religions, and entities of light or fire, as well as islands and mountain heights, have traditionally served as figuration. The Olympus, the Hyperborean Sea, sacred fire, this all pertains to the realization of, first of all, the perennial nature of divinity, and this, especially the sacrificial nature of the lower realm in order to attain divinity. This is possibly also one of the single most important thing as far as the lower realm is concerned, the lower nature of being. As you understand, these natures are somehow compenetrating one another, because you could not really attain, like, if this is the point, like, you could not really attain back unity if you weren't provided with the elements that would get everything back into that one, right? And so there is a very specific process that is surpassing your own limits, in the measure in which these limits are only a product of your own will, right? In other words, it's not like we have fallen at some point because somebody threw us down. We fell ourselves, and the only reason why we're still here is that we're keeping to sin in the same identical way as before, right? As we decided by pure evil not to come back there. And so every action actually doesn't get us there is of course imperfect, right? But it also, there is the way, of course, of nourishing through such struggle the force to get back and to reattain everything by your own sheer will to power, right? And such are the two natures. One birth was conceived according to one nature, and another according to the other, right? There is always like a divine dimension and a human dimension. There is a transition from one birth to the other, as it is stated, by Heraclius in the Corpus Hermeticum as, quote, "A man is a mortal god, and a god is an immortal man." Right? There is not a hypostatization of the two dimensions. Christianity as well, in its purest Catholic belief, of course, does not say that, right? But it also observes that a new stage in the degeneration of mankind has happened, for which humanity has to be reminded of the sin that it's accomplishing only, and therefore inverting the trend, because this is sort of the last call by Saint Ewan, at the same time highlighting the privilege bond that exists, like the connection between the two natures, that is also clear in the same Christian doctrine, right? In Christology. And yeah, today we haven't talked at all about that, but if you wonder how this crystal clear, like from the millennia, incarnates literally in Christ, just look at Christ's divine and human nature in one. And this is in one person. This is the, say, if you wonder again, you see that the Vulgata is, you see, Christianity copied the other religion. This was the only religion that existed. The role of Christ is the one of the winning hero, triumphant one that actually manages to attain. What do you think? That Christianity was invented somewhere? That there were different religions out there that people at the time reasoned in this sort of categoristically, say, a-conceptualized, a-contextualized reality. They all believed the same identical thing, right? And then, of course, like, there were the ones at the lowest, as we were saying before, like the true savages at the bottom of the entire thing that had just maybe a little light on the thing, but of course had not yet acquired the force to develop this higher concepts and beliefs. And so the struggle is still on. Now, the traditional world, by the way, recognized these two significant poles that we have. So it's a spectrum, actually, between the two. And to some extent, there are stages. Like, it's not like you simply are in between. At least the way in which we have fallen is, we exist as humans, for example, and that's sort of an important divide. But if you look at the animal world, and it will explain how this fits also evolution, that is actually compatible with tradition, except it goes in reverse. Animals would be essentially the not what we came from, but what other of our once divine kind degenerated into, right? And it makes perfect sense, except you have to explain how this would have mechanically happened, like with all the species in time. It's extremely controversial and sort of weird, and I say it myself, but there is still a way to that, and at some point we'll make a video about this, because it's as crazy as interesting, objectively. And so, of course, what was important in tradition was also discovering the paths that connected the two natures, beyond the world, encompassing all its forms, both visible and subterranean, both human and subhuman, including demonic entities. Tradition understood the concept of hypercosmia, that is to say, the overworld, right? So a cosmos that existed above, right? As if we were in our own chaotic one of becoming, as we've seen, whereas there was a superior one of perfection. And in this dichotomy, one state falls into another, one state leads to the liberation of the other. Right? They are, if you want, providentially connected, because you know what providence actually means. It's the literal capacity, as we were saying before, of the visits to see the future and to act upon it. Right? That's literally what providence is. It's connected with your own capacity to make things succeed, because you know how it will happen, because you are making it happen. It's incredibly crucial from a moral and scientific point of view. And so that, let's say, tradition perceived spirituality as that which transcends also the life and death between these two dimensions. Being and not being, you see, this is the limit of the action itself. If you don't act, you can't even produce other life. So tradition acknowledged that external existence or living, while in the netherworld life is it's externally expressive as it contains within itself the potential to come back to the overworld, right? And that is the only meaning that life has in our human dimension, that is reaching the upper cosmos, and so reaching a level of existence that is more than we know as life. It's the eternal life, right? And you understand how basically every religious imperial human principle has been founded historically on the, at least say human, say any cultural aspect is being founded on this attainment, right? If the human highest aim is not participating in the higher realm, right, and an active seeking an active liberation from the bonds of the same humanity, it falls short. Reflect on how we have been told that being human is a positive thing, right? How many times, like, we must be human, man. We're all humans, we have to be more human. It's humanity, man. It's all. If people had gone to a first world primary school, and unfortunately, like, it's not like first world primary schools are like that. No other around the world for that matter. They would know that human means dirty, right? The actual etymology of human means dirty, right? You belong to better that I don't say it. There is a reason for the memento mori. There is a reason for the fact that, look, there is something you have to do. It's not like what we've been deprived of, thinking, well, you will just die one day, and so, after all, who cares, right? It's, first of all, nobody buys that, because at that point we would have just committed all collective suicide. If that was the entire point of existence, there would have actually been no point, right? Humanity would not exist anymore. But secondly, most importantly, humanity realized its condition of inferiority, a condition of limit, right? So yes, we are all humans in the sense that we can find all together, of course, cooperatively, a way to, as we've seen, individually and collectively, a way to fix it, because we are in the same condition. But it's not that our condition has to be celebrated, right? It's not that being human is something to be proud of, right, in front of the truth. It's actually a massive tragedy and problem, and this is what we should teach people. Like, the fact that we're limited, the fact that we suffer, the fact that we are finding hysterically, like, always some sort of thing to rely upon outside of ourselves without fixing our own problems and being autarchically reliant and metaphysically projecting, is the greatest problem of all. And you understand how sort of completely habituated to this concept we really are. And we are celebrating essentially an abortion of nature, of divine nature, of the higher world, as, in all its obscenity. I mean, look at the disgustingly vulgarity, the vulgar tastes of our own world. Ugly, stupid, unaccomplished people, completely worthless beings that are celebrating in their irrelevance just to sell, them something that is selling them the delusion of not being seen by others as this disgusting things, right? And look at, I don't know what kind of ads are run on Schwerpunkt, but look at what's like the average advertising is aimed at. It's not aiming as a person that is thinking about their future, they're working hard, they're actually good people. Of course, this is also the obvious thing, like the fourth estate is, morally speaking, the one is always rightfully exploited. Like the problem, how you combat Marxism is not saying we shouldn't exploit the fourth estaters. We should. It's a metaphysical imperative. Like, if you have the potential to attain absoluteness and you still are even less than the average human standard, well, there may be something very serious going on that you want to fix. The sense, of course, is that, we are celebrating that very alienation from our own being. We'll talk about this when talking about sex. Think about, the entire transgenderism concept, that we are literally celebrating not the eternal being and the say self-actualization for whom we really are and we're born as. And so what we are determined by the higher nature with our own means to actually become, but we are essentially celebrating the alteration of ourselves outside the very basis that we are, and essentially just denying what we are by indoctrinating ourselves into some sort of mental illness, into thinking that we are something that by definition we're not, and even obliging others to believe that lie to make them lie. Right? The ancient Persians were quite clear. The leader who said a single lie saw the eagle of glory flying away and his realm destroyed. If for only one lie. Think about the world in which you live in and think about the consequences of that. That may not be, nuclear war. It can be. That's not the worst that can happen, telling the truth. But in fact, the very degeneration of our soul, the death of the sacred in the heart of man. And this is very important because if you realize, say our human stand, for example, now I don't want to get too controversial than I already am, but the mere concept of human rights. That is not to say that it's wrong to support human rights, but as long as you understand them just in the human dimension of it, meaning that there is no such thing as human rights anywhere, nor physically nor metaphysically. It's just like an action that we enacted, in fact, for with our, say, political, social means to protect each other to an extent that is not even universal, and that has turned out to be somewhat functional to that, say, awakening that redeeming principle within ourselves, like that lays within all of us in potential. And so, of course, adopting actually part of tradition in this regard, but it's not like anything human is ever fully right. There is not such a thing. Every human action is rigged by sin, right? Which means, by the way, that especially if you consider it according to the doctrine of the true nature compared to God, basically all human authority is false. Every law is unjust and violent. Every institution is ultimately vain and perishable. Right? This is very important because it's not just about saying, okay, well, I do what the Bible or the Quran says. It doesn't end there. You're just a human. What do you think you are? Do you think that you can simply enact it? Do you think that your forces are enough just because you read something? You have really understood anything about religion. And there is, in fact, there also very deep respect towards the institution per se, because even though authorities, laws, etc. are run by human beings, still the only reason why they actually succeed is the superior principle of being, right? From above and towards higher realms. There cannot be any other authority in the world but this. So while this is, as we just said, rigged, still, if you don't have that power yourself, it means that you're not better than it. Right? If you individually and single-handedly crush an entire state, maybe you're meant, you're on the way to divinity or something. But it's mostly evident that if you don't even know where to begin with, you can even just physically palpate how inconsistent you are, right? And that it gives you the dimension in front of the universe of what you really are. But this doesn't mean that actually that potential within the soul is not able to transcend that, right? This is why this is a Catholic belief, because it embraces the universe in potential in its entirety. Protestantism, for example, denied that, right? And there, things start in fact being a severe problem. But we'll see this perhaps better in another video, right? Reacting to, again, somebody else's success or to an institution without actually providing with an actual, let's say, alternative, like an alternative power, an alternative institution, simply saying nobody can actually achieve anything because whatever you do is useless, is incompatible with tradition, right? And so the other thing here is not that, say, only God is free, right? And pursuing freedom is in this sense okay, but it's not like you can attain freedom. At least you could, but evidently like billions and billions of people don't. So you may want to consider that there is some systemic issue with you being like other people and starting to fix that, if anything. But in that sense, this distrust towards authority is incredibly dumb, because either you offer a better alternative and manage to substitute that, to reform that authority or something, or you're just failing and you don't get anywhere, especially with this inverted sense of freedom that is not freedom, in fact, of simply say, leave me alone. Isolationism is the first indicator of the cultural inferiority of a people, right? It's not, as I said before, that you live out there in some isolated reality of that, without accomplishing anything, remain paranoidly separated from the world, that you attain a traditional Catholic principle. You don't obtain actually anything. That's actually a mental illness, and it stems from the fact that you perfectly know that you're not capable to do anything more than living your miserable human life and not transcending it and taking over the world. So liberty, knowing how to grow within the system, is all, right? Freedom is just for God. And in order to go there, you have to just learn what liberty is and how it works, right? Before even thinking that you can be anywhere close to that when you're just like a human being. Now, the traditional world, of course, recognized, as we've seen in multiple videos, the concept of divine royalty, right? Divine kingship. It was familiar with the act of transition. We've seen it in that sense again of the fact that this a great deity in human form, like the great rulers really were in the moment of their heroic action, living in a condition of becoming that separated them from God and people at the same time, because they were not God themselves, but they were rising as the Sol Invictus, in fact, from a condition that was in this becoming positive, and not like the one of humanity that at large was not positive, right? And was at least so detached by the positive elements of it that was seen in this different dimension. This is truly a lonely one and a difficult one. It's the one of who is in charge. So the initiation, we'll look at all these aspects in tradition. The two principal paths of approach, heroic action and contemplation. These are both necessary. You cannot act if you haven't thought things out accurately. The mediation is the right and fidelity, the great support, traditional law, and the caste, right? The earthly symbol of this being the empire, right? So you have you see also in the right, infidelity, as we were saying before, you have religious dogmas and you have specific rites and practices, but you see the right is not in itself, as we understand it today, just a material issue. That's how people say, but it's just a right. It's not just a right. I mean, in that material sense, it can be the point is the power of he who administers that is the person that in the moment in which he actually administers that gives the power to the action. And the same goes the fetus, because the fetus is taking that leap in the dark, proving that you're able to sacrifice even what you care about the most in the process, for how sure, for how providential you are, for how much you think that God is there, or your capacity to see in the future. Hence the traditional law, hence the sense it's not just a merely sclerotic idea that more or less works in the world for some strange reason. It's the will of the ruler. The same goes for the order that stems from that. One of the cases in the empire being the cases of the estates, if you prefer. There's always a mobility there, and of course also a contrast, a conflict. And then the empire, that perfectly as bodily represents this hierarchical order of ecumenic Catholic nature. And so you can argue that these elements form the foundation of the hierarchy in traditional civilization. Right? They have been entirely obliterated by the sense of, say, humanity. Right? It's humanity. It's all about humans, man. We decide of it. No. Right? Without God, you cannot accomplish anything. And this has been, like, just if you looked back at history before 200 years ago, and the entirety of it fundamentally, and still also in the last 200 years, the world having something to do with God, as always, in spite of the terrible, despicable decay, are really, these are a very didactic exercise, and that's also why we talk history. That's also why we always identify what worked historically and what didn't. Right? It's not as simple as things worked for a system, let's say, just because, again, it's stuck in line of principle with the okay, this is tradition and it has always win. It's about the person. It's about the person and what they do and they don't. You can have somebody that waves the banner of modernity as opposed to tradition. There's still some tradition in it, and it will succeed if he who waves the banner of tradition has become too sclerotic, not fit for it. That's how things happen. However, it's also true if those are the standards of tradition, let's say of those who should uphold tradition, and even from the other side you don't find the same thing, yes, the other side can be better in relative terms to this fallen world. There is fallen, say, standard of traditional belief, but in fact they will sort of damage the entire system. They will damage, the outcome will be disastrous. There's plenty of instances of mostly revolutions in history in which the lower element sort of took over. Of course it collapsed afterwards because there was no way it could stand on its legs, and so the result is that everything went worse for everybody involved. Right? This is really typical. Wu instead is able to maintain tradition by moral standards, is able to go on and accumulate power, and so inverting the trend of the fall. And of course, like, this doctrine of the two natures is just like regarding this sempiternal dimension, and the other one of becoming, that is wrestling to come back to the one or to die in the enterprise, and degenerating to nothingness, is I think, so crucial for any other possible doctrinal understanding of tradition, and we should maintain it very dearly, as it's practically the only way to make sense of the situation. At least if you realize as we will see better in other videos, like the full implications of the same. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.